Hey guys, so a while back I talked about my army, my Stormcast Eternals army that is inspired by the Terracotta army. Now, I had done a lot of experimentation up to that point to decide how I wanted to do the paint scheme and what I wanted to base my army on. During that process, I came up with a plan for my named units and any badass units like commanders and such that I wanted them to be real people. So that would be real people in armor versus the terracotta, and that would help things to stand out on the tabletop. So that way everything wasn't just one block color. So I want to show you guys how I plan to do a combination of the Eavy Metal paint style with a Tabletop Plus paint style, and also still have enough color on the model to be tournament standard ready, and actually enjoy your time doing it because each model doesn't take forever. Now, I do this with two different models, one of which has a more gold color, which is what I plan to do to replicate across my army, and then one that has more of a copper color, which is one that I decided not to go with. Unfortunately, with this video, I ended up having some file corruption issues, so I ended up losing some early footage of the copper colored one. We'll talk about how I ended up getting to that color, but unfortunately I don't have any footage showing me do that. But I do have footage of the gold one, and we'll talk about the fact that I'm using an airbrush in a bit, but just know that this entire video can be done by hand, and outside of this early stage with the airbrush, I do end up doing everything by hand after this. So one of the first things I wanted to do, I need to go ahead and put down my base tones. Now, I wasn't super worried about getting anything on the cape, as we can cover that up later, so I'm just going to hit everything with RETRIBUTOR armor, giving everything a really nice all-over, one-over coat, and I'm not really worried about going super crazy. However, I am going a little bit lighter on the upper raised surfaces, meaning those that would be exposed to the light, and the reason I'm doing this is because I plan to brighten them anyway, so why make them darker when I'm going to have to make them brighter? Now, like I said before, this whole thing can be done with a brush, so if you don't have an airbrush, just go ahead and slap some RETRIBUTOR armor across the whole model and don't even worry about darker or lighter, just get it all on there. So this is one of the spots where we ended up having an issue with corrupted files. So I hit it with Agrax Earthshade first and then Seraphim Sepia. Now, I did apply these through an airbrush, but you can do these by hand. And then I did a heavy dry brush across the entire thing with RETRIBUTOR armor. Now, you could, if using an airbrush, just hit directly above with RETRIBUTOR armor, but I know some of my older models that I already have painted have been done with a dry brush, so I want them to have a very similar feel. Then I hit it with Fugan Orange. This is from the upper regions and to the side. This is to kind of give the illusion that this gold is reflecting some kind of light, and when you spin it in your hand, it doesn't show up quite well on camera, but in your hand you can definitely see the orange. Quickly moving on into edge highlighting the gold. Now, this does take a little bit of time if you want it to look good, so I recommend taking some time. Go ahead and edge highlight everything that you think isn't going to end up having some kind of color on it and is going to remain this gold color. Now, in our case, we ended up using Liberator Gold, and Liberator Gold is a nice bright gold. It doesn't take away that yellowy tinge to the gold, but it is a nice bright gold. And I went ahead and applied this anywhere that I thought that I was going to leave the gold details, so the shoulder pauldrons, the edges of the chest plate, the tops of all of the armor, and then we ended up turning this into a little bit of a glaze and glazing the chest plate as well as the top of the legs, the calf muscles, places like that where light from the sun above would directly be reflecting off the armor and making it brighter. You also want to make sure that any kind of lions or any kind of iconography that is etched into the armor, the bridges of the nose, the edges of the eyes, the same way that you would highlight a face, you want to go ahead and add some highlights to that. Even if it wouldn't make sense, we're just going to add some artificial highlights, and that's just to make those areas of the model pop. Now, I actually recorded this back when I did the Terracotta Army, and that was a long time ago, and I have actually lost the footage. I thought I had saved it onto a backup thumb drive, which is why I deleted it off of my phone. Unfortunately, I should have double checked before I did that. Now, I was able to use these two colors from Turbo Dork to make this paint scheme. What I did is I painted one from the upper right region and one from the lower left region. That is both mirrored front to back to ensure that what little color change between these two shades of red would be coherent no matter where you looked at it on the model. Now, these colors are really great because With Turbo Dork, you can kind of mix and match, so we could have faded reds into greens. It would have been a very stark change, but you can definitely go through the array of colors when it comes to Turbo Dork. I really do like their products, and I think they make really great color change or color shift paints. But unfortunately, yeah, I lost the footage to this, and I am sorry, but we're gonna go ahead and move forward with the tutorial and talk about how I highlighted this model. So I ended up highlighting everything with Retributor armor, although I didn't go crazy with it this time. I just stayed on the shoulder pauldrons. Now, when it comes to the more coppery color, I actually started with a Caliban green as my base tone, and then I'm going to be going up to Castellan green and then mixing Castellan green with Moot green to do my extreme highlights. I'm kind of doing something similar with the model on the left, which is going to be blue, which I have gone ahead and base coated in Castellan blue, but we'll talk more about that later. So Castellan green ends up being the base tone for all of the fabrics that have yet to be painted, but it's also our first layer of highlights on everything that I have already base toned with our Caliban green. So when I go to do my edge highlights, I'm not just hitting the upper raised edge, but the one underneath as well. And this is going to give a lot of contrast because we're going to leave our original base tone in the deepest recess. So we're treating our Caliban green almost as if it is the wash that would get left behind after a dry brush. So very little of this is going to get left behind in places where the ripples and the ruffles in the fabric are very close together. However, on like the main cape here, where there's quite a large surface area, a lot of this original color is going to get left behind. The best way to think about this is that we are adding a highlight into the shadows. One of the things that really changed the way that I paint models is when I realized that by adding a highlight into the shadow, we create a more dynamic feel to what we paint, and we also add another layer of realism, because as fabrics and other things bend and take shape, the things that we normally consider to be completely in shadow oftentimes have some kind of highlight to them, whether they're reflecting light of their own or absorbing light from somewhere else in the environment, especially fabrics, which can go completely translucent when held up to the light. So it's important when working with fabrics to also put a little bit of a highlight on the back side, not just leaving the shadows completely in darkness, but to bring in a little bit of color, a little pop of color, and then anywhere where it'd be in complete darkness, like between the character's legs where no light would be getting at all, obviously that's going to be super dark. Anywhere where it's up against the character's armor, that's going to be super dark. So that's why we can end up with a highlight in what should be the shadows. Now I chose to add a little bit of highlight to the shoulder pauldrons here, again with the same color. Now you could skip this stage, and with our edge highlight color, you could use a little bit of a dry brush to kind of blend it in on the shoulders, and you would probably get the exact same effect. But I wanted to build this color up using various layers, and so I started here. Then we're going to take our next layer of highlights, and we're going to only apply those to the raised surface and the sharpest edges. And that is going to create this mix of contrast that is really going to push this model to the next level. A lot of times when I tend to do this painting scheme, I get a lot of compliments on how my fabric looks so realistic, and it honestly comes down to putting a little bit of highlight in the shadows. One of the most important things to keep in mind when placing this highlight down is how is the armor interacting with the fabric, and that can create a situation like toward the back of the leg here where I end up creating a bit of a Y shape, where although there is a very sharp point in two different very distinct places, that is simply the way that the fabric is stretched over the armor. So I don't want to do a wide sweeping highlight, I just want to draw almost a straight line to those points and then draw a sweeping line away from it. And that's just because of the way that the fabric is draping off of the armor. So we draw a sharp line leading to the point and a sweep going away from the sharp point. And that is how I kind of think about things when I go and do all of my highlights. And then one of the last stages I do to kind of put us back in the direction of making this feel like a GW paint scheme is I take inspiration from our Eavy Metal that we see in all of our codexes, and I make some of my highlights a little thicker in places. I make my highlights on the edges a little thicker so that I can come in with some pure moot green and add them as an extreme highlight. And then I also make sure that the bottoms of all the fabric gets a nice thin line, and all the edges of my fabric gets a nice thin line. Now I know some of you are not a big fan of the Eavy Metal paint style and you don't want to put that super sharp thin line right down the side of the fabric or across the bottom, and that's fine. What you can do is you can kind of stipple the edge with your edge highlight brush, and that's going to give this worn out appearance. I think it looks wonderful. I think it looks great. But with these models specifically, I wanted them to have this Eavy Metal inspired look, which is why I'm going with those super sharp, straight up and down vertical highlights as well as the horizontal ones along the bottom of the fabric. It's another reason why I'm doing these super straight highlights across that tabard there on the front, right under his neck, that little scarf thing. I want to really give homage to the Eavy Metal style. I love the way that it looks, but I also really like my interpretation of it. Something that I would like you to keep in mind while watching this, you're noticing that I'm not trying to make these perfectly smooth edge highlights. I'm not going in and smoothing out my lines. I'm going in very quickly with the brush and just sketching out where the edges of the armor are and where the edges of the fabric is. That is because this is a tabletop standard. If I wanted to spend all day just doing the fabric, I would spend all day doing the fabric. That is not the intent of this paint style. This paint scheme is meant to be a quick and dirty, knock out an entire 10 or 20 or more models in a single weekend and get it done so that you can play with it next weekend. If I wanted to do a full Eavy Metal paint style, I would. If I wanted to go a full over the board paint style, you can look at any one of my other videos where it's pretty obvious that's what I've done. This paint scheme is meant to be quick and dirty, and it's meant to be tabletop standard meets Eavy Metal, and it's the combination of the two, and this is how we get there. So please understand that my edge highlights are not perfect. They're not meant to be perfect. This is meant to get the job done so you can play. Now, to just contradict myself for a brief moment, if there's some areas where the color didn't quite take and you need to do a second take and go over it with a second pass, you now have a guideline for where the bulk of your color should be, so there's no reason to be painting something that hasn't already been painted. So you can be a little bit more precise, take a little longer to put your second coat on, and that's going to really reinforce those colors. This is also the time where we're going to come in with our almost pure moot green and go ahead and add our final highlights. So I started things off with KANTOR blue. For some reason my older bottle of KANTOR blue has somehow ended up with a lot of gloss medium in it, but that doesn't really affect the overall paint. I then end up using McCrag blue as our first level of highlights, and then mixing McCrag blue with Telsius blue, and then going to a pure Telsius blue, and I highlighted things exactly how I did on the previous model, and yeah, it's as simple as that. Now I'm going to spare you guys from boredom because this video is getting long enough. Our next stage is to go in and pick out where we want all of our silvers to be. The most important places is anywhere where there's bolts, you want that to be silver, and then in my opinion I think the chains on any of the iconography should be silver, just because the armor is gold and it really helps to pop with a lot of contrast. Another place is there are sometimes rivets on the bottom of the chest plate, as well as sometimes people like to paint different parts of the iconography with different colors, so just keep that in mind and make sure you don't forget anything on your models. Now the blue figure has purity seals. I have two ways that I really like to do purity seals. One is with TALLARN sand and Ashapti bone, and the other one is Xandri dust and Screaming Skull. Now I didn't have any Screaming Skull and I didn't have any Ashapti bone, but what I did have is I had TALLARN sand and I added a little bit of white into my Xandri dust, and I got close to Screaming Skull and I used that as my highlight. Another thing you can do if you don't have either of those, if you've got a Xandri dust type color or a TALLARN sand type color, you can use that as your base tone and then use Agrax Earthshade and put on 1 to 2 coats of that. It'll really darken up all the letters, which is what I use to darken up all the letters. and then you can use that exact same color as your highlight color because you've now darkened it and stained it so much with your washes. And one thing you're going to notice is that one face is just horrible. It's not great. I admit this. Spending time on faces is definitely important, but that wasn't the subject of today's video, so I didn't want to spend more time on it than what was needed. So this is the video where we're at so far. I'm definitely going to go back in and work on the face and make it more appealing, that's for sure. It won't take a lot to do that. A little bit of glazing with some darker, more reddish tones in a certain place, like in the cheeks, or just under the nose, or above the eyes, and everything will be fine. But again, that's something that's going to take some time, and time was not what this video was about. This video was about how to knock out a paint scheme. I feel after you do 2 or 3 of these in this order, you're going to kind of get down your order of operations, and it's going to be a lot easier to do the rest of them. I know I plan on saving all of these for when I do them all at once. I'm basically going to put those models together and get them ready to do all at once, and I'm going to do all my terracotta soldiers all at once. And that is so that I can get my order of operations down and just knock them all out and not really have to worry about it. But in any case, I hope you found this really interesting, and I hope that these paint schemes inspire you to do something cool with your own stuff, and hopefully you've at least learned something, even if you don't plan to use this style on your Stormcasts. I know this will work really great for D&D figures and many others, as I do this all the time with my own models, and like I said, people really are wowed by them, even though they are as simple as what we did today. So thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, may your display case always be overfilled and your pile of shame never run empty.